Good evening, everyone. Why don't we have a seat? We'll get started with our post-session town hall meeting here. I'm Senator Ron Latz, the state senator here in St. Louis Park, also represent Hopkins, about a third of Golden Valley, all of Medicine Lake, and a quarter of Plymouth. And I'm flanked on my left by Representative Cheryl Youakim, and on my right by Representative Ryan Winkler. The three of us are proud to represent this district at the state legislature. We're going to have about an hour and a half here to have a conversation, to listen what you have to say and to share our views with what happened and what didn't happen at the legislature this past spring. So I'll just jump in real quickly and indicate a couple of ground rules, first of all, for this evening, as we do for all of our town hall sessions. This is a nonpartisan event, so we ask to keep the partisanship to a minimum. And also respect the people who are speaking and asking questions, whether you agree or disagree with what they have to say. Secondly, if you do have any questions or comments, we're going to ask you, after we make our opening remarks, to step forward to the podium here, where your remarks can be not only amplified for the audience here in the room, but also, because this is being recorded for community television rebroadcast, it can be recorded, and the audience at home will know what your questions and comments are as well. So with that said, I'll just give you a very brief background on my part. I live here in St. Louis Park. I'm married and have 3 children. I'm a lawyer in private practice, and I've served in the legislature now since January of 2003, 2 terms in the House, and then since 2006 election in the Senate. And I served 9 years on the City Council here in St. Louis Park in this very room, representing First Ward 3, and then an at-large council seat and as Mayor Pro Tem. In the State Senate, I am the minority or DFL lead on the Judiciary Committee, former chair of that committee when my party, the Democrats, had the majority of the State Senate. And before that, I was the minority lead. So the gavel has switched several times over the course of my service in the State Senate. I also serve on the Commerce Committee this year. When I was chair, I also served on the full Finance Committee as a budget chair. And now I pay attention to those issues, but not sitting on the committee directly. This year was the budget year for the legislature. We have a 2-year budget cycle. The current biennial budget expires June 30th, so we had the task this year of setting the budget for the next 2 years, starting July 1st, 2019. And we did accomplish that. That I would count as something we have to do, but you don't have to do it in a way that everyone necessarily wants done. We just do the best that we can, and the outcomes, which we'll have a chance to talk about, were pleasing to some, not so pleasing to others, and probably on balance somewhere in the middle, which is probably what we can expect from divided government. We have a Democratic governor, a Democratic majority in the House, and a Republican majority in the Senate. So a lot of compromising went into this year's budget and also into the policies that we passed. I would give a brief summary by saying, from my perspective, that we accomplished a pretty good K-12 education budget, putting 2% on the formula for each of the 2 years in the biennium, and putting a cap on special education expenditures to try to protect the districts a bit from being overwhelmed with the cross-subsidy of their general fund money going into special education. We accomplished funding to increase the ability for the Department of Corrections to hire more corrections officers to make them safer in the prisons and to help protect the inmates at the prisons as well, where we've seen a spike of violence, including 2 correctional officer deaths in the last year. We passed an ombudsperson bill for the Department of Corrections also, so reestablishing a troubleshooter and problem solver independent of the Commissioner of Corrections who can act to address grievances within that system. We passed a tax bill that had a modest reduction in taxes for some in the middle income categories and brought us largely into conformity with the federal government's tax changes of the last couple of years. In our local area here, we did pass some modifications at the request of the City of Hopkins to their TIF district, which will give them more flexibility to redevelop areas in the City of Hopkins. We also were able to extend the provider tax, which was set to sunset this year. Well, personally, I think that those expenditures that are funded by the provider tax are better off being funded out of the general fund and general tax system. The fact is, it's a very large amount of money, and it would have created a huge drain on the other areas that we fund, not only health and human services, but it would have been a drag on our ability to fund K-12 education, higher education, environmental initiatives, and so on. So we had a slight reduction in the level of provider tax from 2% down to 1.8%, and the sunset provision was removed. From my perspective, what we did not accomplish was any new funding for the transportation system. We are, I think, now about $7 billion short statewide on projections of what we need to be able to maintain our infrastructure. That would be roads, bridges, and transit, and also to build out the infrastructure that we need to meet a growing population. We did not get paid family leave passed, a mandate that would have applied to most businesses in Minnesota. Someday in the future, I hope that we can accomplish that. I think that's an important step. It would be an important step for our workforce and for our families, but that was not accomplished this year. Another piece that's of concern to people in the civil liberties community especially is, when we almost got it across the finish line, was regulating the use of drones by the use of law enforcement agencies in the privacy category, if you will. And we came very close to that, and we'll have to pick up that ball a little bit later. Two of my signature items, reducing gun violence by expanding background checks for persons who are purchasing firearms, that is handguns and semi-automatic assault weapons. We did not pass, but I do hope that we will get that passed either next year or after the next election cycle. And also the extreme risk protection orders, which would have given the courts, through the initiative of law enforcement, the ability to remove firearms from persons that are showing an immediate threat to persons around them and who have firearms in their home. And one thing we also did not get done was the bonding bill. There was a proposal, in fact, an agreement among some of the leadership to pass a $500 million bonding bill, but it could not all be pulled together with the necessary supermajority votes in the bodies in order to pass that. So there's some hope maybe that will happen. There's actually some talk about pulling a special session together to get a few of the things that we left undone finished. But more likely, I think, we'll be addressing that next spring, which is the more normal year for doing a substantial bonding bill or capital investments bill. I would rate neutral what we did with the higher education funding. We put resources into it, probably not enough to hold tuition all the way down to zero. And there was a disparity between the Minnesota state system and the University of Minnesota system, which always makes me frustrated because I think it undervalues the University of Minnesota in their role they play in our economy and workforce development and education in Minnesota compared to Minnesota State. But both institutions got substantial resources time around. I would say the one thing I'm very frustrated about in the big picture was that in order to make the budget balance, to accomplish what we did accomplish, and make investments where I felt appropriate to make investments, where the legislature concluded it was appropriate to make investments, we had to use about half of the rainy day fund that was available in our reserves for a time when the economy slows down and state revenues start to fall off, which we would dip into to try to maintain a more equitable level of services during the inevitable downturn. It's my hope, however, that maybe the next budget forecast going around will be a little more positive still, and by law we sock away a third of all of that into our rainy day fund. And one thing I'm very proud of in the end was that for the most part, and certainly among all of the leadership, almost all the leadership I would say, was a tone of civility prevailed in the way that we got our work done this year. It did not seem to be quite as confrontational, and everyone worked hard. And sure, we had substantial policy differences, and tempers got a little bit short, as they normally do when you're at high stakes and toward the end game. But all in all, I think people, the legislators and the people who attend and watch what's going on at the Capitol were pretty civil in the way we approached our individual colleagues and the way we handled the large debates and policy decisions. So I'm pretty proud that in the end we were able to accomplish that and hopefully set a tone for our state, if not for the nation, that you can work together with people on the other side of the political aisle and across the political spectrum and accomplish things together that will advance the goals of the state and of the people of Minnesota. So that's my summary. Thank you. Thank you. One applause. Oh, no more. Okay. Thank you. So that's my brief summary, and my colleagues, I'm sure, will have something to add and maybe even differ a little bit. We'll see. But we'll welcome our next most senior legislator, Representative Cheryl Youakim.
Thank you. I don't know about that. I think Ryan Latz and me just took a little hiatus.
Took a
but
hiatus
I'll go next. I'm Representative Cheryl Youakim. I represent all of Hopkins and half of St. Louis Park, basically south of Minnetonka Boulevard. I'd echo a lot of the same statements that Senator Latz made. I would also like to say that the Minnesota House this year really focused in on what we call the Minnesota Values Project. And this is a project that we started about 2.5 years ago, where a small group of us put together a series of questions so we could go out across the state and talk to thousands of Minnesotans to see what they valued. And we learned a lot from what came back. And what we saw was that people really, really value, which might not be to any surprise to any of you, people really value education from early childhood all the way through higher ed. They value having access to affordable health care. And then they also value an economy that works for everyone, and especially for their neighbors as well. So Minnesotans, to no surprise, care a lot about what happens to other Minnesotans. So with that, we kind of put our framework to start on what we wanted to focus on this year. And we ended up putting a down payment on some of that stuff. So we had our education funding was stabilized. We had 2% and 2% on the formula. We froze the special education cross subsidy. We put money into saving 4,000 pre-K spots for the 4-year-old kindergarten program. And then we also added in some money for our Bureau of Indian Education Affairs schools, because every child in the state are our children and should be getting that basic funding formula. In education as well, on the House side, we added in money for the teachers of color and Indigenous to increase the diversity of teachers in our system, and a lot more we can talk about later if you'd like. We also put a down payment on healthcare accessibility. While we weren't able to expand one Minnesota Care, One Care, we were able to do what Senator Latz said, which was to keep the provider tax at 1.8%. What that meant is we kept 1.2 million Minnesotans on healthcare. So that was extremely important. Yes, that deserves a clap. So that was one of the high priorities of this session. And then we also did tax conformity finally. So we did tax conformity and a bunch of other things we can talk about in the tax bill that will lower property taxes, that did a middle class second-tier income tax cut, that stabilized property tax with increase in local government aid and county program aid, that helped our farmers out with school bond levy referendums, and then also we helped with lowered the Social Security tax, and we're nibbling away at that, and a few other things we did with the tax bill. We also did what I was very excited to do, which was some of the unfinished business we had from last year. We finally got the opioid crisis bill across the line, and I know Randy's happy about that. He's been working on this for years. He's in the back of the audience. Ask him anything you want about it afterwards. He could tell you all the gory details. We also were able to get distracted driving passed. We were also able to put in place some drug pricing around our program benefit managers to help with drug pricing for folks. We also were finally able to get the Elder Abuse Act passed to help license our assisted living homes and make sure our seniors are taken care of. We were one of the only states in the country left that did not license our assisted living centers. So we also got a wage theft bill in place, and those were some of the highlights. Personally, I chair the education policy bill. This is my first time with a gavel. It's only my 5th year in the legislature, so that was very, very fun for me to kind of go back to my roots of where I started out in education advocacy. So I was the education policy chair. I was on the education finance committee. I was on the transportation policy and finance committee, and I was on the tax committee. So I kind of got a front row seat on some of the big ticket items, and it was very, very honored to do that. I also had a chance to be on the Snow Days Conference Committee, where our schools had a lot of snow days that they had to make up, and trying to figure out a way to get relief to them and also relief to their hourly employees that were missing out on paychecks when that happened. And then I ended up at the end of session being on the Education Conference Committee. Now, like Senator Latz said, compromise basically means that everybody is a little pissed off. Like, everybody didn't get everything they wanted, but they got a little bit of something. But I think what we can be really, really, really proud of is that in a state where we're the only divided legislature in the country, that we were able to come together and put a budget together without shutting our government down, that kept basic services there for everybody, and put a down payment on some of that systemic change we need to move forward. We also started to chip away at getting our legislature to be more transparent. We added in more deadlines to try to get folks to the table sooner. While that didn't quite work with trying to get our spending targets for conference committee, I'm very proud to say that we had 3 weeks of public conference committees. When the House had a gavel, we met and we talked, and everything was, all the offers were made in public. We had public hearings on the conference committee results before we had special session on every single one of our bills. And people had over 12 to 24 hours to actually read the bills before we had to vote on them. So we had much more transparency than we've had in the past. And it's baby steps. We're gonna have to keep working at it. And I'm very proud to say that we did that. And some of the would be remiss if I didn't kind of mention some of the disappointments. I'd echo the dipping into the rainy day fund. We took $500 million out of that because one side of the aisle just did not want to talk about any increased revenue at all. The biggest disappointment on no increased revenue is our transportation system. While we all agree on how much we need, both sides of the aisle, and what we need to get our system, our roads and bridges safe, I'm sure everybody knows and saw the commercials that it costs us each about $1,000 a year in increased wear and tear on our cars from potholes and traffic congestion that we're spending. And I was very disappointed we weren't able to get any new revenue for transportation, and then also no new revenue for transit, so not being able to build out those extra BRT lines or the arterial lines. And then I was also very disappointed in the Senate's refusal to look at a lot of policy this year. We had policy wrapped into our bills, and we spent 3 weeks trying to coax them out to sames and similars and talk about policy. Even policy that we had passed last year in the bill that got vetoed was a no-go for the other side. So that was disappointing. And then also not having a bonding bill. I carried the Perspectives bonding bill this year for St. Louis Park, and we weren't able to get across the line. One good news about bonding is we were able to get $60 million in housing bonds for affordable housing. So that is one thing that passed, and gives us a lot more to do next year in bonding. So I also was able to work on a bill, and it usually doesn't happen where you feel like you can make a big change with a small statute, but a family had lost, the Westlake family had lost their son to an accident with the LRT. The LRT driver ran a red light. All the cameras showed that he ran a red light, but they were unable to charge him with distracted driving because we had a strange loophole in the law about how we define vehicles when it comes to distracted driving, and LRT trains were not included. So we were able to close that loophole, and I'm working with the family right now to figure out different ways to make LRT a little bit safer for everyone. So was proud of that small success, and other than that, I will leave it over to Majority Leader Ryan Winkler.
So Ryan, maybe you can clarify for us, Ryan, if you get credit in seniority in the House for your previous service before you took a break and then re-entered. Clearly, your colleagues respected you enough to elect you Majority Leader for the House, so welcome back.
We won't have an argument about seniority. How about that? Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Ryan Winkler. I am the representative for 46A, which is the northern half of St. Louis Park, the southern half of Golden Valley, the southeastern corner of Plymouth, and all of Medicine Lake. I was first elected in 2006. I served until 2015 and moved overseas for 3 years, came back, ran for re-election again to that seat in 2018 after Peggy Flanagan went on to run for lieutenant governor. And I won that election in 2018 and was honored by my colleagues to be elected the majority leader of the Minnesota House of Representatives in November of last year. So Ron and Cheryl have really covered everything there is to cover, I think, highlights about this session. My role was really to help shepherd legislation through the House and to help keep a House DFL team together and focused on our priorities. And people sometimes ask me what the biggest surprise of this session for me has been. And for me, the biggest surprise was how easy it was to keep the House DFL team going. We had about 50% of our caucus were first-term members, and 60% were either first or second-term members. So we had a huge group of new people. They were extremely talented people who left other professions that they were engaged in their communities to run for the Minnesota House. They were very dedicated, very able, very focused on trying to serve the needs of the public and being very serious about how to do that best, not making politically calculated decisions about votes and bills, but really thinking about the needs of their districts and their constituents generally, and taking steps forward to make Minnesota a better place. And so in the House, we passed a very far-reaching agenda this year, focused on areas like family economic security, world-class education, affordable, accessible health care, safe and inclusive communities, racial justice, gun violence prevention. We passed a lot of bills. And we passed bills that we think are going to be important for the future of the state and the people of the state. With divided government means that we knew that a lot of those bills were not going to finally be enacted this year. And we did run into some real obstruction in the Minnesota Senate and their willingness to do much of anything. And I will say, as someone who was involved in negotiations all the way through, that it was only really kicking and screaming that we got as much as we did out of this legislative session. It was a testament to the hard work of my colleagues who really never gave up, always were persistently focused on doing the good of the state, and we, I think, laid out a blueprint for what the future of Minnesota needs to look like. And I was fortunate to be part of that, and in as much as we have things that we didn't get accomplished this year, we will pursue them next year. We will pursue them after the next election and the next year after that, and year after year after year until these things are done, because the people of Minnesota need a lot. And one thing none of us mentioned is energy and the environment. We passed very far-reaching energy legislation this year. We had a climate committee for the first time ever in the Minnesota House of Representatives. And I think that there is a real opportunity for us to make some significant improvements on the energy and the water quality side of things in future years, and maybe even as early as next year, despite some of the obstruction that we faced. So I'm very optimistic about where we're heading. This new group of legislators coming in will be leaders in the state for years and years to come, and I'm very excited to be working with them and to continue service with my colleagues Ron and Cheryl. So I think questions would be in order.
So let me just note parenthetically that the House and the Senate took different approaches to procedurally how to go about passing policy, but also the Senate majority took a different approach on the merits of a lot of policies too. And so while I agree with the House agenda from a policy standpoint, part of the difference was that the Senate, generally speaking, does not want to include policy in their budget bills. And the House routed most of their policy through their budget bills, as well as often passing them separately. So you ended up with a conflict in both of those areas as we sorted out stuff at the end. And that was probably the biggest area of conflict between the House and the Senate, was just kind of sorting out some of those policy differences and the process for getting them done. But there is, to be sure, a substantial difference in policy positions between the current majority in the Senate and the current majority in the House. And ultimately, we ended up with what we got. So we are here now to listen to what you have to say, to take your input. If you have questions to ask, we'll do our best to answer them. And since we have a bunch of people here, let's also please try to respect each other's time and not go into lengthy dissertations or backgrounds or foundation building. Be succinct, give us your thoughts, and then we'll have time to give as many people as possible an opportunity to do the same.
It would help too if you state your name and where you're from. So thank you.
Judith Cashton from St. Louis Park. And I met you, Representative Winkler, your first term. Yes, I'm also an MD, and I was at the Capitol for the MMA. So, but anyways, I'm here tonight with the topic that wasn't brought up, which is redistricting. There's a number of us in the audience today that spent a lot of time, and you may have gotten letters from me and other ones of us. And we're very eager to see the end of gerrymandering in Minnesota, and particularly the Common Cause bill that would set up an advisory commission. So I'm interested in, we are in your thoughts about what the future of that is, and has concerns about the idea of a constitutional amendment. First of all, getting it passed in an election year, presidential election year, and second of all, putting something into the Constitution that may not be to our liking, rather than an advisory commission that could be started out and tried. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Well, the House in our state government finance bill, which is where we had our election policy changes, we included a redistricting reform proposal. And we have language related to a constitutional amendment, which we didn't propose the amendment, but language that would help support that in that bill. In the end, we had zero really interest from the Senate Republicans in passing any kind of election reform legislation, and so that all died, went to the conference committee. I think this year we will try again. We will try to see if we can have more direct conversations with Senate leadership to find out if there's something that we can pass this year in preparation for redistricting down the line. I think in general, the House has favored nonpartisan approaches to redistricting. The Common Cause has one approach. A constitutional amendment is another approach. In reality, ever since the Voting Rights Act, panel of judges has drawn every single map from Minnesota and generally done a fair job. So I think that there are multiple ways we need to consider doing this, and we don't want to be in a situation of gerrymandered districts if we can all avoid it. But again, it takes both parties and both bodies to be willing to make those changes.
I will just note, there was a commission a number of years ago, if I recall correctly, Vice President Mondale was a part of that commission that made recommendations for an independent redistricting process that remove it from the hands of the legislature. I frankly think we are in the long run better off with an independent process drawing those lines than having the legislature draw the lines ourselves. But I'm open to seeing what the proposals are, and I think we need to make some progress on that. Redistricting is not far away.
I would echo that too, and I sent on to Representative Schultz's bill for that reason as well. And it was really disappointing. We had a really great election reform bill that came out of the House and just ran into a brick wall. In fact, one of the earlier conference committees set up was just for that $6.5 million of federal money that we just had to change a statute to tap. And it was left undone last year, made us the last state in the country to tap into that money. And the Senate majority party sat on it to use it as a bargaining chip until the bitter end, which is just not the way to go. Thank God we got it passed in the end. But that provision and the provision tweaking keeping private, the primary ballot process, except for the party's access to it, were the only two things we were able to get through in conference committee. So we have our work cut out for us next year.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for having these meetings. Not all politicians do. I wanted to talk about the bill that just passed about for the nursing institutions and the caregivers and the seniors. I know that there was a lot of pushback and resistance from the industry about this. That's why it didn't pass last year. And I just wanted to let you know about my personal experiences in the end of May and currently, and other people I've talked to. My mother was at Edenbrook Edina, and anytime there's an episode, you know that they're supposed to, or hopefully you know that they're supposed to contact the family members. If somebody falls down or if they go to the hospital or something, we're not supposed to be in the dark. I didn't get a call, and nobody from the institution contacted any member of our family ever. I got a call from my brother. Somebody had found out that she was in the hospital, and when I got there, she was dead. I never got to say goodbye to her. And Now I'm trying to get her personal items back and her clothes and this type of thing, and they're not cooperating with me at all. By the way, I don't expect you to do anything with this. I just want you to know, with all this awareness going on of the bill, this is how they're conducting themselves. And as I've stated, I've run across a lot of people that have told me personally. Interestingly enough, some of them are retired medical people. My case is actually mild compared to what I've heard. They won't get back to me, they won't return my phone calls or communications, I should say, or my items, which are now mine. I'm the heir. I've got photos that I can show of you with holes in the walls, been there for over a year, doors falling off the hinges. I will show anybody on my tablet, sorry. Afterwards, I'll show you a laundry list of appalling photos of what my mom was forced to eat and the condition of the place. I've asked for documents, records. I'm not getting any cooperation with that either. And I just think that I'm hoping that this new bill will pass. I know that you talked about, or that it would make an improvement, but I know you talked about compromise to get it through, but I just want you to know that it needs to be added to or modified for the future, and for the laws that are on the books, they're not being enforced. And contacting the ombudsman and this type of thing is a little better than nothing. And I've got extensive documentation to prove everything I've talked about.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Bennett Shields.
Mr. Shields, I'm so sorry for your loss. Was your mother in an assisted living or a nursing
It
home?
was a nursing institution,
Okay.
Edenbrook, Edina.
A nursing home, not assisted living?
Yes,
Yeah, I'm just checking, because House
Sure.
File 90 was directed at assisted living.
mostly, but it also affected
Yeah.
caregivers and family members, and it talked about retaliation, and I've been
Yes.
retaliated against. That's another common thing that these places do. You bring up problems to them, or if they find out that you're contacting the government for, or gathering evidence, they'll do one of two things, and I've met a lot of people do that. They will either say that you are abusing the person, and they'll level these charges against you. They'll give you these false allegations that you're abused, or they will restrict you or trespass you. And it's amazing how many people I have found that have had these similar retaliation. And that type of retaliation protection is in the bill, but I recall it being weak and vague.
Yeah, we still need to do a lot more around this, especially with, I know AARP has been working on an elder care act that would, Bill of Rights Act for elder care, that they're still pushing and working on. And then also, probably a small solace is that we actually put some money in to have more people work at the ombudsman office so that they can respond to those claims a lot faster. And then they also put money into a tracking system to more clearly track all the claims that are coming in so that they could get to those faster as well. But once again, I am so sorry for your loss.
Mr. Shields, I'll echo Cheryl's sentiments. There was some very clear retaliation or anti-retaliation language in the assisted living bill that was passed. To me, the biggest, and there were 20 new staff people in the ombudsperson's office, so hopefully that'll be a robust enough addition that they can respond more, or respond at all, or respond more quickly to the complaints. To me, the biggest missing piece in the bill was the absence of a private right of action.
Excuse me?
The absence of a private right of action, meaning an individual or family member who felt aggrieved by the way they were treated could not actually sue the facility over it under the state statute. Its enforcement would only go through the Attorney General's office or through the Department of Human Services. So we'll continue to work on that as well because I think hopefully there'll be enough resources now to bring this whole licensing scheme into place, and that'll be a big improvement. But we're gonna have to watch very closely how it plays out and fill in the gaps as we can down the road.
The only thing I would add is an encouragement to contact our offices if you do have problems like this and continue to get retaliation or other kind of obstruction. We can write letters and follow up by phone with institutions, and sometimes our offices can help push things loose. So can't guarantee that we can do anything, but if you contact us, we can make an effort on your behalf. that's part of what we do, and I would encourage everyone to do the same. If there are things that are state government related, we can be helpful from our offices and are more than willing to do it. In fact, that's a big part of our job.
Thank you. If I can ask, when is the last time any of you have maybe walked through some of these places just as a quick inspection?
Sorry, I was just toured Shalom Home about 3 months ago.
I've had family in Shalom Home, and I've been to a number of the facilities. I wouldn't say as an inspection, but being present in some of these places is just helpful also to see what's going on.
Same for, I was there, I think, at Shalom in April, and not in nursing homes, but in a lot of group homes. So I do spend time there.
Thank you for your time.
I want to say thank you for doing what you have been doing about gun violence. I really hit the ropes this year seeing my high school age grandchildren being at all of these rallies, walking out of school, and their friends protecting their own survival. And I just want to say this, you know, the three of you, and I know, Ron, you've been on this for years, and don't stop, because it has to change. We must. And, but the other issue is climate change, and that's, I was glad you brought that up. I didn't hear anything about that. I almost feel that climate change issues should permeate every single department in the state, and that there should be like newsletters about it and what they're doing and you know, what can be done. And I wonder, what do you think? What are we going to do? This whole issue of continuing to invest in oil and gas, it's such a hot issue, but we're letting China run the market for, you know, renewable energy with, and, you know, I just want to say this one last thing, and then I'll just listen. We get a note from our, from Excel. We've been doing windmill, you know, you can pay for wind energy, that little thing. And sometimes the really ambitious climate change people say, well, that's kind of a first step thing, that's not too much. Well, they sent us a card and showed what our 1 year contribution was, and it was big. You saved enough energy to run a car, and for our low mileage car, probably 2 years. That really motivated me. And I just want to say that, you know, I think the state needs to do things like that. Get us going. But tell us about what's going to happen with climate change in the legislature. What can we do? Yeah. Don't say anymore. What are y'all going to do?
Well, so Elaine, the two major pieces of legislation related to climate that we passed this year, one was a Renewables First bill, or provision, which requires that as you bring more energy into the system, it has to be renewables first, unless for some reason that does not prove cost effective. And under current energy pricing, I think wind is by far, is significantly cheaper than any other form of energy, and solar is dropping so quickly that it will quickly be at the same place. So that would probably be the biggest thing that would drive us fastest to a 100% renewable level, and then we passed a 100% renewable standard. Now, both of those provisions died in the negotiations, but we did pass them through this year. We had a pretty far-reaching set of policy agenda related to climate, including protecting community solar and expanding it, expanding the electric bus fleet, and it kind of on and on. So we were pretty aggressive, and we will continue to be, but it's not, you know, it is not, and you mentioned Excel, they actually support most of what we pass, and so does organized labor, which has been some of the jobs displaced by this transition to renewable energy. And so good policy actually gets supported by everyone involved. We just need to get past this political roadblock.
The market is taking over, and I think a lot of people are not seeing that. Any other things?
I would like to add too, I liked how you said that we should have climate change permeate every discussion we're having, and I saw a little bit of that in the committees I serve on. So transportation, looking at the electric vehicles for the Met Council fleet. We had a proposal that unfortunately didn't make it in about a mileage-based user fee pilot project to start, getting people to understand how their mileage affects how much they should be paying. And then in education, we had solar on schools that didn't quite make it, but we were able to get a benchmark 3 provision in that it's a free program. Districts can plug in all their information from their utilities in, and it'll show them where they can save money and how they can do that. And so it's a free program to kind of do an energy audit for your school. Then also, we were able to pass some farm to table for the food supply chain in the ag bill. And then there were a variety of options for tax credits in the tax bill that didn't quite make it, but that's stuff we're going to still be pushing. So yes, you're right, it has to be a global picture.
What kinds of things in the credit?
I'd have to
Tax
look
credit.
because I can't quite remember. We heard so many bills in the House
Yeah, I know.
Tax Committee.
The age that we are, it's really hard for us to renovate our house, but, like the outside and windows are really showing up needy right now. But, yeah.
Well, I support everything that my colleagues said and the legislation that the House was able to pass. We didn't do that much in that regard in the Senate,
Yeah.
unfortunately. I will add, and I think I probably speak for a lot of us in this room, that climate change is the existential question of our time.
Yeah.
And we're going to see the effects dramatically. We already are seeing the effects dramatically. I think the major climate adjustments we're going through right now with regard to rainfall and flooding in our, and the difficulty getting crops even into the ground, and getting transportation down our flooded rivers. We're seeing that as well as greater storms, and it's going to have a big impact on us in our lifetime and a much greater impact on our kids. In fact, I think there was a letter to the editor in the paper 1 or 2 days ago from a young person, probably Generation Z or younger, that basically said, we're the ones most affected, and it's going to be an issue that we're going to start voting on. And I think we have to make it that important as we're considering who to vote for.
Yeah.
If that becomes an important issue, and piggyback right back to your opening statement about guns as well.
Yep.
When these issues become important enough that they're driving people's decisions who to vote for, it'll get traction at the legislature, and the state legislative policies will change.
Well, thank you all for the work you've been doing.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cliff Cashton. My question has to do with Restore the Vote legislation. I believe that the Restore the Vote was part of the voting and elections package that passed the House and, of course, didn't go anywhere in the Senate. And I'm curious as to your thoughts about its prospects in the next session and whether you perceived any possibility of bipartisan support for restoring the vote.
Well, we've been fighting that battle in the Senate for quite a few years. I led the battle when I was chair of Judiciary Committee, with a lot of support from across the board, and we even had some bipartisan support on that initiative as well. Restore the Vote, for those who aren't real familiar with it, is allowing convicted felons who right now can't vote even after they're back in the community until they're off probation or off parole, to be able to vote as soon as they return to the community and start paying taxes and living in the community and having a much more direct stake again in the success of their community. And we all have a stake in their success because we don't want them to commit new crimes and go back to prison, right? And the studies have shown that the ability to vote and participate in those kind of civic activities helps them remain out of prison and be productive citizens. We had some debates over exactly what form Restore the Vote should take on a bipartisan basis a couple of years ago, but it's not an issue that gets a lot of traction right now in the Senate, so it didn't make it to the finish line. There is still hope, and I think eventually it will become pretty well established that we need to make some changes there. Florida was able to do it through initiative and referendum. We don't have that kind of process in Minnesota, so it would have to either go through a full constitutional amendment initiated by the legislature or it would have to come from the legislature itself in changing these statutes. I think eventually we'll get there.
I firmly believe in it, and it was part of our elections bills that passed out, and actually on the House floor, I sit in front of Representative Ray Dean, who's been working on this issue for years, and the whole last week of session, he had his Restore the Vote t-shirt folded up on his desk, and I don't think there's anybody more disappointed than he was. It has bipartisan support. This is all about the leadership in the Senate blocking that for some odd reason, because in both bodies, I believe it has bipartisan support and has support among our community too. So hopefully as we keep pushing, it'll finally happen.
Thank you.
And I think, just to add, I think next year it likely will be sent as a separate standalone bill from the
I was
House to
gonna-
the Senate.
I was gonna ask that.
And I think that will be in combination of a number of other criminal justice reform pieces of legislation. We did send the immigrant driver's license bill this year on its own. And next year, there isn't a budget, so we don't have any kind of negotiating leverage to try to push as many pieces of forward-looking policies we can on part of the budget passage. So we will be sending individual bills and trying to work directly with Republican senators to see if we can find some common ground and make more progress. It's possible, but I think it's a very difficult thing for Republicans to get done with Republicans,
I should
even though
note
some
that,
support it.
I should note that the conservative movement supports it as well. I mean, the Right on Crime groups, the Koch brothers groups, they support these kind of criminal justice reforms because they see it as better overall for reducing crime. So it's only a matter of time before the more conservative legislators on a broader basis get on board with those kinds of policies.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm George Reret, and I've had the pleasure of meeting all three of you individually. You know my story, so I won't go into my personal story, but I'm here, of course, for equal parenting, shared parenting, however you'd like to call it. I'm very proud of the work that three of you did this year. The distracted driving, the senior care facility changes that were made, those are all very important things. I hope that insulin for all can get through next year. I think that's crazy that it was blocked this year, but I would pray that that happens. I think we're very lucky to have the three of you representing us. I mean, we have the leader of the House sitting here. We've got Ron Latz, who you've been there since 2002. You're the head of the judiciary when the Democrats are in charge. You're very powerful. People listen to everything you say. And Cheryl actually came up through the ranks knowing you and working with you and trusts you and believes in your opinion so greatly. So the three of you influence so many people, and you're so powerful. My issue is I believe that a child, when parents separate, should have equal rights to time and communication with both parents. And in today's world, of course, we know that's not true here in Minnesota. There's only a 25% presumption. And so many fathers, typically fathers, sometimes mothers, end up with every other weekend with their children, maybe a Wednesday night for dinner, maybe they get 3 or 4 days vacation in the wintertime, sometimes they get a little summer vacation, but that's about it. I spent way too much time and money, as did many other people, to try to get to 50-50. When I've talked to you in the past, Senator Latz, you've said to me, you know, it's a complicated issue because it's not just parenting time. There's this whole payment system over here, and it's so complicated. And when I talk to you, Representative Winkler, you say, well, you know, it's a good idea. I just don't know that Minnesota is ready for it. I don't know if the judicial system is ready for it. Carol Levin did a story on shared parenting maybe a month and a half ago. It ended up being one of the most commented on stories that they've done in several years. They estimate that over 500,000 Minnesotans are affected by these decisions, whether grandparents, aunts, uncles, sisters, brothers, every single year. And unfortunately, about half the marriages end in divorce, and the number of children being born out of wedlock increases every year. It's now up to about 40% for the children being born out of wedlock. They're not getting to see their fathers. It's a very, very sad situation. When you go into any school, the teacher says, I want both the parents involved, the dad and the mom. I want them both to read to the children. I want them to come to conferences. I want them to know what's going on. When you go to the doctor's office, they tell you the same thing. Then a divorce happens or a separation happens, and the court all of a sudden undervalues the contribution of one of the parents. It's a very, very sad thing. It's more than money. The money doesn't matter. The time matters. I'd love to understand what the three of you could do to help move this next year. It's time. This has been going on as long as you've been sitting there.
That's true, and thank you for your comments. I know this is a very personal issue for a lot of people, and that's why the issue is still on the agenda for the legislature. When we had hearings on the topics, when we listened to the conversations about them, and when there was a really substantial family law reform package that was put together a few years ago, there was not a consensus within the stakeholders that are involved here, the matrimonial lawyers, the parents groups, the judicial system, the judges, the guardians ad litem that are involved in the process as well. There was not a consensus about the best way to approach this. Part of the issue was the cliff in terms of funding and how does that get affected for support payments, and how do you adjust that to reflect parenting time. And one of the most difficult problems with it was the perception that if you put a presumption into place, you actually make it much more difficult for court, in the 5% of cases where the decision is made by the court, to fashion a package that works the best for that particular family. Because sometimes you can't work a 50-50 split, but there's still no way to overcome a presumption that it should be a 50-50 split in parenting time. If one parent works, 50 miles away from where the kids go to school, for example, or lives 50 miles away from where the other children live. So it gets pretty difficult to be able to fashion a one-size-all-fits rule, and the presumptions, the way they're proposed to be written, can have a great amount of difficulty in terms of shaping the decisions by the courts. And that's why a lot of us felt that in the end it was better to leave enough room in the middle of the presumptive time for the courts and for the parties themselves to fashion rules and guidelines that worked best for that family. That doesn't mean they always get it right. And in fact, they're probably like divided government, you're going to get results that neither party is always really pleased with. But that's what makes it hard when you pass a statute, because statutes are going to affect absolutely everyone. And if you're not careful, you can make it much more difficult to get results that work for individual families.
And Senator Latz, those specific items that you named were addressed in the bill that passed through the Family Services Committee, Karen Housley's committee, but your committee didn't hear. Those items were addressed on how to deal with those situations. So hopefully, if I could ask in the off season here, I know you're a busy man and you don't make money doing this all year round, but if you take the opportunity just to read the bill and understand it, and if you want any help, I've got lots of people that will sit side by side with you and show you every one of the objections that you just talked about, how it's handled. But if you want that, I'll provide it to you.
I appreciate that, thank you. And
Yes.
of course, in the committee process, the chairs of the committees decide what bills to give hearings to. And our chair this year opted not to give a hearing to that bill within the Judiciary Committee. In fact, there were a lot of bills that he chose not to hear.
I understand.
I got my colleagues nodding their heads because there's a lot of stuff that the House wanted to accomplish that our chairman wouldn't give a hearing to in the Senate Judiciary Committee either.
Yes.
But thank you for the input.
Yes. Did you have any comments?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Ron said, and I think it just points in general to the need to move by building consensus. I generally agree with the goal. I think I've shared that with you. I do think that moving towards a common understanding that 50-50 parenting absent unfortunate circumstances of some kind should be the expectation. But I think moving the whole family law system that direction and moving it while understanding the consequences and not moving with kind of one abrupt decision, but rather to build consensus and have it evolve in that direction is the way to make it be lasting, rather than it kind of, I think the bill that came forward last year was highly controversial. And I don't think a controversial, fast-moving family law change is the way to make the end goal that you have become a reality. I think it has to come through more consensus building.
Well, and what's interesting is it did have bipartisan support, and in the House, it did get through the Judiciary Committee. Your committee would not calendar what they got through. And then when it came up for an amendment, you said, and got people to actually change their vote while the vote was open. You yourself did that. So that was very sad for me to see, because you were taking away what people wanted to vote for. Representative Brand, a first-year person, told me I was pressured to change my vote. And I was told, you need to do this by the leadership. Very sad.
Well, you have to understand that it was bipartisan but extremely controversial.
Oh,
And
well,
if
and how many bills are not controversial? Anyways, I appreciate your time.
But I think it's important for you to understand that if that amendment had gone on the public safety bill, which included gun violence prevention, criminal justice reform, and a great number of other things, would have failed. It would not have passed. That amendment would have brought it down because of its controversial nature, and that's precisely the way that this kind of reform will not happen. It has to be done by building consensus on both sides.
Will you help us build consensus?
I'm open to helping move forward in this direction, yes.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add too is, it is really hard, and maybe it's one of those, this year, I kept hearing over and over again, it's a budget year. Myself, as the education policy chair, I had over 400 bills that came in my committee. We had time to hear about 95. So, and I'm a firm believer on more weighty, meaty policies like this need to go on their own. And maybe the stakeholders need to get back together to the table again and find a way to maybe lift up that floor at that 25% up further, but not at the 50-50, to just start incrementally bringing that floor up. I'm just saying one of the reasons why maybe it's controversial that I have heard, that we need to still give some room. So I know you're shaking your head, but just give me a minute here to finish my sentence. That we need to do this on its own is my main point, and we need to have the stakeholders come together to the table again to see if we can build an even more consensus, so it isn't such a controversial issue by the time it gets to the floor. There's a lot of things when it comes to compromise that we have to do to get something on the table to start moving in the right direction, and this might have to be one of them.
Thank you.
That was a 10-minute exercise, that one. My name's Ken. I am from Golden Valley. I was just really wondering, it's by accident I came today because Golden Valley paper had no notice of this meeting. To your knowledge, what papers did?
Well, my office put out press notices to all of our local papers. So what the papers choose to print is up to them. We don't control the press.
And on the average, have you had these meetings once a year?
We regularly do these meetings, one before a session or at the very beginning of the legislative session, and also right after the legislative
And you
session,
had
so
one
twice a year.
Beginnings before the session?
Yes,
And you put out,
yep.
Yep, and then I usually have January to March every 2 weeks at the local library. I know many people in the room have attended them. And those I actually luckily must have been a slow news day, they actually printed them, but we did put out press releases weeks ago to try to get the press to print them. But
they had an article about the spring meeting after it occurred. What good was that?
Well, one thing you can do, I think if you follow either of us or any of us on Twitter, or if you're on our email distribution lists, because we do, I've got, 3,000-4,000 people on my email distribution list, and we publicize it that way too. And it's just an information sharing process, so you don't have to have any particularly support or non-support for the positions that I take, but it can give you some information on that as
Okay.
well. In fact, while the point is there, maybe I'll just say to the audience at home also, you can do that, at Sen Ron Latz is my Twitter account. And our email list, you can send it to sen.ron.latz@senate.mn. Did I get that right, Marcus? You're the one. Ron.latz@senate.mn? I never send myself emails, so I should. Tell me what it is, Marcus, and we'll have the others share that information there as well.
It's Ron L. at
ronl@senate.m. Now I got people showing me their accounts. So please, if you want this information, including on our public gatherings like this, you can sign up that way.
Cheryl, did you get your email cleared up? Because I haven't seen an email from you. I know you send them all the time in almost a year.
You still haven't got my weekly updates? Did you resubscribe on the House
I did.
website?
I
So-
just concluded that you had blocked me.
No. Bob, I never block you, and we still have to take that bike ride, so. But no, just shoot me another email so I remember, and I will personally add it myself. I don't know why they did a clearinghouse. We had been doing automatic enrolling into our web servers, and then we were told we couldn't do that anymore, so then they went through and called lists, and things got screwed up, so email me and I'll put it in myself.
I got the email from Ron. Okay.
Good. So his list isn't screwed up.
Yeah.
And you can go to any of our House member websites and subscribe to get our weekly updates, and most of us are on social media too.
Mr. Winkler and Latz, do you have plans to maybe attend any particular community events this summer so we could interact with you during the summer?
Yes, I don't have my full schedule in front of me. I was at the Golden Valley Pride Festival on Sunday, and Parktacular is coming up this coming weekend in St. Louis Park, and those are the two that pop into my head right away, but yes.
Sure, okay. Anyhow, the one item of interest tonight to me was the cell phone legislation. Could I ask the two of you in particular, have either of you been co-sponsors of any bills up to this point in past years?
Specifically related to the cell phone
Yes.
issue? I don't recall. I support those issues. I support that change. I don't recall if my name is on the bill or not.
Okay.
Yeah,
And,
we passed the hands-free
I
bill this
understand.
year. I supported it. I supported it last
Sure.
year as well.
last year?
Yeah.
Okay.
It took me a while, frankly, as the research started coming in, to demonstrate the impact of it and how, frankly, distracted driving is just as dangerous as drunk driving. And once we started seeing the experience in other states, I came to believe quite firmly and spoke vigorously on the floor in support of the bill and supported it behind the scenes so we could get it to the floor for passage.
But it's like drunk driving, any kind of distraction. If you
That-
have a distraction, you have no business driving a vehicle.
Well, that was my point, sir.
And frankly, it should have been done years ago. If you lose family members because of that kind of irresponsibility, there's absolutely no excuse.
We all agree with you entirely, and I will say that family members who lost loved ones as advocates for the hands-free legislation were very important and powerful advocates, and I think are probably the biggest reason why that bill finally passed. It had been up for years, and we'd making some progress on it. We've had we made some progress with distracted driving in the past, but the hands-free bill, when you have people standing there with photographs of their lost loved ones year after year after year, it has a big impact, and I think that's a big part of why that bill finally was enacted this year into law.
And I urge you to support strengthening that kind of legislation and if necessary, frankly, increasing fines. You're lucky if you catch the people, let alone are able to fine them. So you have to have some kind of a carrot and stick, approach to the issue, I think, to even have any serious consideration given to it by people who have total disregard about public safety on the highways, in any case. Okay. I'm curious, I'll throw out one more thought. In the question by Mr. Shields about the nursing home dilemma, how much serious consideration was there during the hearing process to present information about what kind of staffing levels exist in other states proportionate to population. How do we fit into the picture here? Because it's been highlighted through the local media numerous times over the years, and nothing really moved as far as head count. It just seemed to always kind of fall back. I don't know. Do you have any thought along that line? And then I'll just say
Yeah, well,
thank
you
for,
asked about the hearing process, and I don't serve on the committees that would have dealt with that particular aspect, any kind of staffing level requirements within the bill. I do know that when it didn't get across the finish line last year, that the then Commissioner of Health, who is also continued on as Commissioner of Health under the new gubernatorial administration, she initiated a pretty lengthy process of investigation and stakeholder meetings to put together what was really a very complicated bill, and to develop a consensus among all the stakeholders, including those institutions that are being regulated, newly regulated and licensed. And so it took a lot of energy and effort to put together the package that finally did come to the floor with the consensus that enabled it to be passed. I couldn't tell you exactly what the provisions are or what they were proposed to be.
take some interest in that, because that's the bottom line. If you don't have the staff to respond to the problem, all it does is mushroom, and you hear stories like this is ridiculous.
You know, part of it is also what the staff is paid. We see in nursing homes and assisted living facilities, people leaving and going to work at Walmart or McDonald's and making more money. And so that leads to high staff turnover because they're doing harder work, maybe more rewarding, but more challenging work, caring for people. And that is a budget question, and a lot of that comes from the state. And making sure that we are adequately funding an aging population's care is going to be a bigger and bigger issue as the years go on, and we need to make sure that we do a better job.
Thank you.
I would say too that we have put in place too a tracking system when it comes to the money we're putting into nursing homes and making sure that's getting into the employees' hands, as well as making sure it's connected to the quality of care they're providing. And so you'll be able to see some changes soon.
I'm going to let folks know we did schedule this to go from 6 until 7:30. It's a little bit after 7:10 right now. So we will continue, but we'll try to adjourn the formal part of the meeting on time, and anyone who wants to stick around to talk for a little bit afterward is welcome to do so. Please go ahead.
Yeah, great. I'm Ellie Kretz. I'm in Hopkins. This is Zoe. She was coloring. I'm previously from Plymouth, so previously was represented by Anderson, and Paulson. So I can say attest to the town halls and that they don't have to do this. And my previous representatives at state and national levels and U.S. levels never did them. So I highly appreciate this. I know you guys aren't getting rich doing this job. So I've checked. You're not. So I do appreciate your
Thanks
service.
for rubbing it in.
Yeah, sorry. First, I'm going to just rattle off. You don't even have to respond. I'm just going to sort of say what issues are important to me. Appreciate the election security. I know that was a battle that was far too long to get. Gun violence, I echo the previous, certainly, speaker with a 4 and a 1-year-old. Obviously, it becomes far more of an issue. One area I think that maybe you have addressed or have not, which is, the shooting drills. It's recently come out that the shooting drills actually are not beneficial. They harm the children, and they give prospective shooters a path to know exactly where they have to go. So while I would appreciate very aggressive gun control, frankly, more than even what's being proposed. I think at a minimum, let's, take a look at the shooting drills. The next issue is mandatory vaccines. I had to take my 1-year-old to urgent care several times. She's fully vaccinated, but fun fact, some stuff looks like measles. So you have to, with people not vaccinating. So I certainly would like to have the non-health exemptions removed. I understand that certain children cannot be vaccinated due to health, but as a family, that was frankly a fairly high cost to go to ensure she did not pick up measles, even though she was vaccinated. I want good access to birth control for my kids and for everybody, and I want to have safe legal abortions. It's already begun after Alabama and Ohio and Georgia, underground networks to get women out of those states and into other states to be able to access this. My children will always have access because, frankly, I'm not poor. And so I will always be able to, if my kid comes to me and says that they need help, I will probably be able to find that help. And frankly, it's not fair. Pre-K. So she just enrolled in Hopkins Pre-K. It was the first time I went home to my husband, and I said, this is the first time that I know that because we are reasonably well off, she's already at an advantage. She has pre-K through the public schools. It's $13,000 a year, which we can pay. We pay for 2 children, fun fact, $34,000 a year in childcare. Again, we're not 1%, but we're also not poverty level. So we've budgeted it, we can pay for it. I don't know how people pay for this stuff, I gotta be honest. If you are not working we both work for 2 Fortune 500 companies, and I don't know how people pay for it. And with that, I can pay a little more in tax. I know no one probably ever tells you that.
They tell us that all the time in this room.
Yes. But if it means that my kids have equality and they have a right to this stuff, and they're not frankly given an unfair advantage because of who their parents are or where they grew up or the color of their skin, we have a very big problem in this state of racial disparity. And we need to fix it, and my kids are biracial. They're Chinese and Norwegian German, I guess. But that needs to be addressed. And then my last thing, and then I'll shut up, I swear, is, as the other person said, none of this matters if we don't fix climate change. I'm liberal, but I'm not a hippie tree hugger, but we need some government help here because nobody's doing anything. So I appreciate your thoughts, certainly. Again, that was a lot of issues. I don't expect you to address them all, so.
I think you just described the House DFL agenda this year.
There we go. Like I said, I'm happy. I'm much happier in this district, I promise. I'm much happier than in my old.
I do have to add, you must have heard the NPR story from Jillian Peterson.
No.
About the gun violence. I've met with her. We're going to have her come in next year in ed policy. She's a professor at Hamline University who's studied school shootings for 2 years now and found some interesting trends. And I mention it because one of the trends she found was the active shooter drills and how they're affecting our kids. So
fair, yes.
And ed policy will be revisiting that. We've also been, we had a hefty agenda on policy and trying to deal with the opportunity gap, whether it be through better mental health, through looking at discipline disparities, through bringing in districts that are doing it well. And we're going to keep pushing on that next year in a policy year. And thank you for mentioning the access to birth control. And you should know that our House DFL education policy bill had comprehensive sex ed for schools. That was medically accurate, age appropriate, and still had the parental opt-out. And you should have seen the emails I got. It was
I had a coworker
baffling.
showed me and said, do you know the DFL is trying to teach 4-year-olds how to
I know,
masturbate?
and
And
it
I
was-
said,
that is-
I don't know the logistics, but I'm pretty sure they did not agree to that.
That is
Yes.
not true. There's
Right.
a lot of misinformation out there around
TMI,
that.
but yes.
And we are going to be pursuing that again next
Great.
year. And you should know
Fabulous.
that the representative that carried a bill is the Unitarian minister
Ah,
and
excellent.
2 of our doctors. So no, very age appropriate, medically accurate, and fitting
Yes.
in with the faith communities. So
Got it.
I just want to thank you for mentioning that, and of course the early childhood. That's where I started my advocacy work, very close to my heart. We have to do something about making not only pre-K more accessible, but also making sure that we have affordable, accessible childcare. It's a big issue here, but it's an even bigger issue in greater Minnesota. And Minnesota is one of the top in the country of having either the only parent or both parents working outside the household. So quality childcare is early childhood education, and we need to address that.
Great, thank you guys. Appreciate that. But really, thank you for the town hall. It's foreign to me. I'm not used to it.
You have to come to my January through May and March next year for every 2 weeks for the libraries too. Good.
Hi, I'm Deb Ellsworth. I live in St. Louis Park, and I'm part of that redistricting coalition that's been working on that thing. So I'm not going to go into that again, but I just wanted to say that I went to a committee meeting for the first time. I've never been to the legislature to see them in action. And it was the one Virginia Cleburne's bill that got passed out of the House. First of all, the room was packed, and second of all, I'm impressed by how much you guys do. I left at 10 o'clock at night because I was getting tired, and I guess y'all stayed till midnight, your coworkers did. And also, it gave me a little hope that maybe in Minnesota, our two sides can work together, because it was Republicans who were in the minority on that committee threw out a bunch of amendments, and some of them got accepted by the Democrats on the committee, and they seemed kind of shocked. What, really, you're taking this? So that gave me hope that maybe we can be reasonable and work together next time more. Anyways, the other thing I wanted to say was that, and people have mentioned a lot of my issues, but that I think we need Minnesota to be a leader state in a lot of these areas. I still think of us as a progressive state. Certainly St. Louis Park is a progressive city. And I would love to see us, because the federal government is seriously gridlocked, and the president is rolling back all these environmental regulations and letting coal companies dump their ashes and rolling back car stuff and all that. But I think if the states like California and the other ones that are serious about doing good environmental laws work together, and Minnesota could join them, that would give strength in numbers, and from what I've heard, the car companies would even appreciate having standards that they all have to live by. So I would love to see us being leaders on that and being leaders in civil rights. I was going to mention the abortion thing too, because that obviously just came up in the news recently a whole lot with George and all that. Generally, I would like to see Minnesota be a leader in protecting our human rights, our civil rights, and progressive agenda. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Bert Hansen. I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota. I just want to thank you for all the things that you do. I'm in basically full support of everything I've heard you talk about this evening. I appreciate all the accomplishments that you've made. I know you burned the midnight oil, and you worked well past midnight, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning in many cases to get some of these bills through. So I'm grateful. My main topic here, I'm a volunteer and parent and supporter of shared parenting. I fully support joint, equal, full shared parenting for fit, loving, caring parents, which I am. And the vast majority of parents in Minnesota are all three of those things: fit, loving, caring. And they want to be there in the lives of their kids. And they're going through, families of divorce are going through some of the hardest times in their life. You know, and when the current system basically requires them to go into the system and really get kicked when they're down. It's an adversarial system that requires the parents to go at each other. And in many cases, it's completely unnecessary. And having been through this system myself, I can tell you it is currently a very broken system. And sadly, I would say that it's not just broken, it's purposefully broken. I think probably to maintain the status quo, the financial interests of lawyers practicing in a system. There are guardian ad litems and other advocates that earn financially from the system as it is today. And in Norway, for example, shared parenting is the law of the land. This is not a revolutionary, crazy idea. This is normal de facto practice. Both parents are considered valuable, equally valuable to both their mothers and father. Their mothers and fathers are equally valuable to their children. Children do best. Decades of childhood research clearly demonstrate, it's like global climate change. 98% of global climate change scientists will tell you that humans are the cause of man-made climate change. 98%, look at any meta-study, 98% of all child development research, all the arrows point in one direction. This is not a controversial subject, at least among the researchers, the experts, the doctors, the medical people who work in this field. And what it does is it pits the parents at each other and creates adversarial relationships between the parents. And how are the children best off when the parents have a huge incentive to say the worst possible thing about the other parent to get a leg up in court? That's today's system. It's broken, broken, broken. And it doesn't have to be this way. in the land of Norway, where it isn't like this, the bridges are not, I'm almost done, the bridges are not burned, and the result is a year later, the parents are both at each other's, separated parents that are both at each parents' soccer matches, chess tournaments, fencing matches, whatever it is, because they love their children and they're supportive. And those bridges between parents were not burned in the first place. So, as a volunteer, as an unpaid volunteer, I would like to ask each of you, representative, would you make some time to meet with me to discuss shared parenting and how we get some traction? This has been in the legislature for 20 years, and we need to get this done. Would you make some time to do a one-on-one to discuss shared parenting?
I have spent a good amount of time talking directly with constituents about their experience. I am willing to continue having conversations about how to potentially make some changes on a more consensus basis. I'm not necessarily going to commit to just one-on-one to get your perspective.
Okay.
But I am willing to continue engaging on this topic.
Oh, okay, thank you. Senator, would you be willing to meet with me?
Representative Winkler put it the same way that I would. I too have been engaging in this issue for many years, and I'll continue to do so.
Okay. Representative, would you be willing to meet with me? Just talk. It's building consensus.
I would echo what they say, and I actually, my go-to person is standing right behind you with Ms. Tepley.
Okay.
So
Okay.
she's a constituent that we've sat time with, and
Okay.
really appreciate.
I know
her
we're short on
viewpoint.
time, but thank you. I thank you for considering.
Hi. Thank you for continuing to hear me. Means a lot to me. I support many of the issues and topics that are important to all three of you. And the ones that didn't pass, that you hoped would pass, were crushing to me. So I'm with you. There's one topic, one issue that we do disagree on, and that is, and I'm going to try to do this in 2 minutes so everyone has time, is equal and shared parenting. I come from I have a large network of family and friends, Democrats and Republicans, men and women who all support a presumption of equal and shared parenting. So it is a bipartisan issue. And many of us stayed up late to watch the vote on the 29th. After the vote, I didn't know anyone else was watching it, and after the vote, my phone kept pinging with texts until about 5 in the morning. It meant the world to me because it showed me that everyone who cares about my family is interested in this topic. It's a high priority. Under the current law, families are going into debt, filing for bankruptcy, and rationing their own food and medical care as they struggle to retain quality time with their son, daughter, or grandchild after divorce or separation. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and for the first time in my life, we're struggling to get my prescriptions. My Humalog was available on Saturday. We keep putting it off one day at a time because we don't have the copay for it. Expecting loving parents to pay $100,000 or more for family court and legal services doesn't seem right to me or in the best interests of our children. We're experiencing it firsthand, and we think we're going to be okay in the end in terms of our granddaughter. It looks that way, but we'll be financially devastated and we will never recover from that. The current system does not create a foundation for healthy families. Rather, it stresses families to the breaking point. And I'm going to stop so someone else can have time. But the one thing I'd ask you to contemplate is, how does that benefit our children? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I didn't think I'd get in under the wire. Hi, I'm Shelley Bakken. I live in St. Louis Park. And I'm a social worker who's proud to say I've worked in the senior living industry for 31 years. I want to say thank you for the work that you did on House File 90 and passing assisted living licensure legislation and electronic monitoring. I, of course, work with providers, and we are happy with the outcome. And I served on 2 of Commissioner Malcolm's task forces over the system, and I think that was the most wonderful process and really allowed education and understanding on all sides. So if that could be replicated over and over, I think that's fantastic. I just agree what you said earlier about staff wages, and I hope that in the next session and whenever possible, you continue to advocate for higher wages for staff and increase funding for the elderly waiver program so that all kinds of folks could live in assisted living communities if they choose to. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your service on that committee.
Hi, I'll just be
So
really quick.
let's just do the last 2 here, and then we're going to wrap up the formal part of the meeting. Go ahead.
Randy Anderson from Golden Valley. I just wanted to first of all thank all of you. I got to spend, because of my employment change this year, I got to spend a lot of time at the Capitol, and so which I really enjoy. So I appreciate everything you all do. Thank you for the opioid bill and getting that finally done. I can't 3 years. I'm glad that major part is behind us. And I would like to see again. I'm going to echo on restore the vote. I've worked on that now for I think this is going into my 6th year. And I would like to eventually see us get that done. But also a big issue I think that we didn't get to address was probation reform. And we had good support from the Americans for Prosperity, a lot of conservative groups too that wanted it to go, and for whatever reason it didn't. So that's what I would like to see for sure. Us work really hard on next year, some good probation reform. So thanks, guys.
Randy, thank you for your work. And on probation reform, that was another area that the Senate majority was not willing to step up to. But there is a pretty, but there is a broad bipartisan consensus that we ought to be doing some things, and it's smart to do some things. We can focus our resources where they need to be focused, and I'm confident that we will get to it.
Thank you all for your service. Quick question. Hennepin County, as well as the City of Minneapolis and the Park Board, all agreed to change a historically objectionable name of John C. Calhoun to Benemakoska, and a court decided on the impetus of a group of protesters that only the legislature could make that decision. Do you see any hope of the legislature coming to terms with that issue?
Well, we did pass it off the House floor in an omnibus bill because it came so late in the process that we did the bill. Representative Jamie Becker-Finn had it, and unfortunately didn't make it through conference committee, but I think that's one of those policies we're going to be looking at again next year.
Yeah, I think the court's decision was that there's already a statute in place that prohibited the change being made administratively. And that's why it dropped back into the legislature's hands, because the legislature many years ago set the statute that was not followed by the process. So whether it falls back into our laps for decisions next year, I guess that remains to be seen.
And I would observe that the recognition that we are in Dakota land seems to be a highly partisan, controversial issue, even though it's a simple historic fact.
Sadly enough. Thank you.
Ron, you have room for one more really quick one?
Okay, one last really quick one.
Of course, I'm Bob Bossman. I'm from St. Louis Park.
And you get
And
my emails, I know that.
I know, and I get your emails. Would the three of you,
I just emailed my LA to make sure.
good,
With
would
your
the three
email.
of you please take a message back to Governor Walz that as I was listening to Minnesota Public Radio, and I know there was very tough negotiations, and he came out and he only had positive things to say about the negotiations and the other side. And then later, I heard the majority leader from the Senate come out and say the same thing. And this is the way that we should be functioning in Minnesota. And I was extremely proud, as everyone should be proud of Governor Walz, and I give him the credit for all of this happening. And please keep it up, because this is what we need. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a great positive note to end our town hall session on. So thank you again for coming. Those of you at home who are watching this, thank you for your participation. You know how to reach us. We welcome your input any time of the year. So thank you and have a good evening.